At sunset, Charlotte watched the old hens scratch through a fresh layer of leaves. Not all of them laid eggs. Not all of them recovered fully. Some would not survive another winter. But their value had never depended on returning to what they once were. The county had judged them by one declining function. Charlotte had seen everything else they could still do. They mixed carbon with nitrogen. They exposed insects. They broke down waste. They helped rebuild soil. The hens were called worthless because they had stopped doing one job. Charlotte saved them because she could see the dozen jobs nobody had bothered to count. By the time Charlotte brought the hens home, the afternoon sky had turned the color of old tin. Her farm sat 6 miles beyond the county road, where the pavement narrowed into gravel, and the gravel eventually gave way to 2 muddy tire tracks. 20 acres surrounded the house. But very little of it could still be called productive land. The eastern field had once grown corn. Now it carried only thistles, broom sedge, and patches of bare clay. The garden behind the kitchen produced weak vegetables with shallow roots. After heavy rain, water collected in low places and remained there for days. During dry weather, the same ground hardened into plates that cracked beneath Charlotte's boots. The soil did not absorb water well. It either held too much at the surface or lost it too quickly. Charlotte had inherited the farm from her uncle, along with a mortgage, 3 broken implements, and a barn roof that leaked in 12 places. The tractor had not run in 2 years. The manure spreader had rusted into the weeds. One side of the chicken house leaned so badly that she had braced it with salvaged fence posts. She had spent most of her remaining money repairing the well pump. That left almost nothing for fertilizer. A dealer in town had given her an estimate for enough soil amendment to treat only the vegetable garden. The number was more than she earned in a month, working part-time at the feed store. Hauling compost from outside the county would cost even more. Yet behind her barn, materials were piling up everywhere. There were bales of spoiled hay that had gone black along the bottom. There were sacks of damp wood shavings from a cabinet shop in town. Oak leaves had collected against the fence until they formed a knee-deep ridge. A neighbor had dumped 2 loads of horse manure beside the old shed. The garden itself produced weeds, damaged vegetables, and vines that Charlotte had been dragging into an untidy heap. Each material seemed useless on its own. The leaves were dry and slow to break down. The manure was wet and heavy. The wood shavings resisted decay. The vegetable scraps collapsed into sour, slimy pockets. Charlotte had tried piling everything together the previous spring. She assumed time would turn it into compost. Instead, the outside dried into a crust, while the center became wet and foul. When she opened the pile with a pitchfork, the smell forced her backward. Nothing had mixed properly. Nothing had received enough air. The farm was not short of organic matter. It was short of movement. That problem followed her everywhere. The fields needed rebuilding, but she had no machinery to incorporate material into the soil. The waste piles needed turning, but she could not spend every evening lifting wet bedding with a fork. The garden needed fertility, but she could not afford to import it year after year. She needed a system that could work, even when she was tired. The hens arrived just before sunset. Charlotte backed the borrowed trailer beside the old poultry shed and opened the first cage. For several seconds, none of the birds moved. Then one thin red hen stretched her neck toward the ground. Charlotte had scattered a layer of straw inside the temporary pen. Beneath it were leaves, a little manure, and several handfuls of cracked corn. The hen stepped down cautiously. Then she scratched. One foot pulled backward, then the other. Straw flew behind her. She lowered her head, found a kernel, swallowed it, and scratched again. A second hen joined her. Then 6 more. Within minutes, the quiet pen became a constant rustling machine. The birds kicked through the straw, separated clumps of manure, exposed beetles, and dragged damp material up from beneath the dry layer. Charlotte stood outside the fence and watched. The hens looked terrible. Their feathers were broken. Several had pale combs. Some were too weak to compete, and remained near the waterer. But the flock still possessed one powerful instinct. They searched by disturbing the ground. Her neighbor, Everett Cole, leaned against the fence with his arms crossed. He had helped tow the trailer from the auction and had spent most of the drive questioning her decision. "You bought 100 mouths," he said, "not 100 workers." Charlotte kept watching the birds. "They're already working. They're scratching for food." "I know." Everett looked at the spoiled hay, the leaf pile, and the heap of manure behind the barn. "You think they're going to clean all that up?" "No," Charlotte said. "I think they might help me move it." He laughed once. Not cruelly, but with the certainty of a man who believed the outcome was obvious. "You need a tractor. I need a system I can afford." As darkness settled, Charlotte carried the weakest hens into a separate enclosure with fresh water and feed. She knew that hungry animals could not be expected to repair her farm. Their recovery had to come first. Still, before closing the shed, she examined the pen. The smooth layers she had spread only an hour earlier were already mixed. Leaves had been pulled into the manure. Straw had been broken apart. Damp material had reached the surface. It was not compost. It was not yet even a proper pile. But it was movement. Charlotte looked from the hens to the waste stacked around the barn, then toward the hard garden soil beyond it. For months, she had seen separate problems: hungry birds, rotting vegetables, wet manure, dry leaves, exhausted soil. Now, for the first time, she saw the possibility of a cycle. The county had sold her a flock because it could no longer produce enough eggs. Charlotte had not yet proved they were wrong, but before the first night ended, the hens had already shown her something the auction report had missed. They still knew how to turn what lay beneath their feet. Charlotte began with 12 hens. They were not the strongest birds in the flock, but they were alert, willing to eat, and steady on their feet. She moved them into a narrow enclosure beside the barn, where she had spread a shallow layer of dry leaves over old straw and damp horse manure. The mixture looked wrong from the start. The leaves sat on top like a brittle blanket. The manure had settled into heavy clumps beneath them. Vegetable scraps from the kitchen had collapsed into wet patches near the fence. Charlotte had built compost piles before, but she had never built one around animals. She did not know how much material the hens could move, how quickly they would tire, or whether they would ignore the pile entirely. For several minutes, the birds remained near the gate. Then Charlotte scattered a cup of cracked corn across the surface. The first hen stepped forward and pecked at a visible kernel. When the next piece disappeared beneath a leaf, she scratched backward with one foot. Then again, the dry leaves opened. Another hen joined her. Within moments, all 12 were working. They did not move carefully. They kicked straw into the fence, tore apart soft vegetable scraps, and dragged damp material from below to the surface. Their claws broke the edges from manure clumps. Their beaks pulled at cabbage leaves and exposed beetles hiding beneath the bedding. Charlotte leaned against the gate and watched the pile change. What had been arranged in separate layers began to lose its boundaries. Dry material mixed with wet material. Buried scraps met the air. Small pieces spread across the enclosure, instead of remaining in dense pockets. The hens were not turning the pile evenly, but they were disturbing it constantly. That mattered. Charlotte had learned from her failed compost heap that organic material could rot without becoming useful compost. When too much wet material settled together, air disappeared. The center became sour, dense, and unpleasant. The hens attacked that density by instinct. They were not trying to improve the compost. They were searching for food, but their search created movement. By late afternoon, the enclosure looked as though someone had worked it with a rough garden rake. Leaves had been pulled into the manure. Straw had been shredded into shorter pieces. The surface was uneven and loose. Charlotte added another thin layer of dry bedding before closing the birds inside the shed for the night. The next morning, she repeated the process. She spread kitchen scraps in several places instead of one large pile. Then she covered them lightly with leaves and scattered grain over the top. The hens learned quickly. As soon as Charlotte opened the gate, they rushed toward the new material and began scratching. Some birds followed the grain. Others hunted insects attracted to the moist scraps. A few selected pieces of vegetable matter and carried them away from the flock. By the third day, the enclosure no longer smelled like a waste pile. It smelled earthy, with only a faint trace of manure. Charlotte crouched near the center and pushed her hand several inches beneath the surface. The material was warm. She pulled her hand back. Surprised, the morning air was cold enough to whiten the fence rails, yet the mixture beneath the hen's feet held heat. She tested another location and found the same thing. Warmth meant microbial activity. The material was beginning to break down. Charlotte did not mistake it for finished compost. The texture was still coarse, and much of the straw remained unchanged. But something important had begun. The hens were combining materials that had previously resisted one another. The dry leaves and straw supplied carbon. The manure and fresh scraps supplied moisture and nitrogen. The chickens added more manure while mixing the layers and exposing them to air. No single part created the process. The system depended on the relationship between them. Charlotte began taking notes in a school notebook she found inside the kitchen drawer. 12 hens. 1 wheelbarrow of leaves. Half a wheelbarrow of old straw. 2 buckets of damp manure. Small amounts of kitchen waste. She wrote down the smell, the warmth, and how quickly the hens disturbed the surface. She also recorded what did not work. Large cabbage stalks remained untouched. Long strands of hay tangled together instead of mixing. When she added too much grain, the hens found it quickly and stopped scratching deeply. The next morning, she used less grain and buried it in several thin layers. The hens worked longer. Charlotte realized she was not simply feeding them, she was directing their natural behavior. By placing food beneath the surface, she encouraged them to turn the material. By adding small layers instead of heavy loads, she prevented the bedding from collapsing. By observing where the birds refused to scratch, she found areas that were too wet or compacted. The hens became both workers and indicators. Everett returned on the 5th day. He stood beside the enclosure and watched the birds fling leaves over their backs. "They're making a mess," he said. Charlotte opened the gate and stepped inside. With a fork, she lifted material from the center. The lower layer was darker than it had been earlier in the week. The manure clumps were smaller. The vegetable scraps had softened and nearly disappeared. She held out a warm handful. "They're making contact," she said. "Contact with what?" "Dry with wet. Carbon with nitrogen. Waste with air." Everett stared at the material, then at the birds. "That still isn't compost." "No," Charlotte said, "but it is becoming something." That evening, she stood alone beside the pen as the hens settled inside the shed. For months, the farm's waste had remained in separate piles, each one waiting for machinery, money, or labor she did not have. Now 12 weak hens had begun doing the first stage of the work. Not perfectly, not quickly, but continuously. Charlotte looked toward the remaining flock. The county had seen birds that no longer produced enough eggs. She was beginning to see 100 small engines, each powered by hunger, instinct, and the need to scratch. The experiment had not yet rebuilt a single field, but beneath the surface of that rough enclosure, the first real change had already begun. Charlotte did not expand the experiment immediately. For another week, she kept working with the same 12 hens, measuring what they could do and, just as importantly, what they could not. They could scatter leaves, break apart soft waste, and expose damp material to air. They could shred straw with their feet and turn hidden grain into hours of steady scratching. But they could not move heavy manure from one end of the yard to the other. They could not judge how much moisture a pile needed. They could not tell the difference between useful scraps and food that had spoiled too badly to be safe. The hens supplied motion. Charlotte still had to supply design. She began by clearing the narrow strip of ground behind the poultry shed. Using salvaged fence panels and rough lumber from the collapsed side of the barn, she built 3 adjoining bays. The first bay was for fresh material. The second was where the hens would work. The third was for resting material that needed time to finish breaking down without birds walking through it. Each bay had a different purpose. That distinction mattered. Before, Charlotte had thrown everything into one heap and expected decay to organize itself. Now she wanted the materials to move in one direction, from waste to worked bedding to finished compost. She covered the floor of the first bay with coarse branches and broken corn stalks. The uneven base would help keep the material above the wet ground and allow some air to move beneath it. Over that, she added a thin layer of old straw, then leaves, then a small amount of horse manure. She kept each layer shallow enough that she could still see the one below it. The pile was not supposed to become a sealed mass. It was supposed to remain open enough to breathe. The next morning, Charlotte moved the 12 hens into the second bay and gave them a fresh layer of dry bedding. She scattered cracked corn beneath the straw, not across the surface. The birds began digging at once. Their feet pulled the lower material upward. Their bodies pushed the pile outward. Their beaks tore through soft leaves and searched along the damp edges where insects had gathered. After 2 hours, the surface had changed completely. Charlotte added a forkful of prepared material from the first bay. The hens spread it. Then she added another. Instead of dumping a full wheelbarrow into the center, she fed the system gradually. That was the first major improvement. Small amounts remained loose. Large amounts became compacted. The hens could work through a thin layer in a morning. A heavy load would bury the lower material and reduce airflow before the birds had time to open it. Charlotte developed a routine. At sunrise, she checked the birds first. She looked for bright eyes, steady movement, and clean drinking water. The weaker hens remained in a separate recovery pen. She refused to treat sick or exhausted animals as labor. Only after the flock had eaten did she inspect the compost bay. She pushed her hand into the bedding, feeling for moisture and heat. If the material clung together in a wet mass, she added dry leaves or shavings. If it fell apart like dust, she sprinkled in a little water. Then she spread fresh material in several small patches. The hens did the rest. By the 4th day, Charlotte noticed that different materials changed the way the flock worked. Dry oak leaves were light and easy to scatter, but they broke down slowly. Straw added structure and prevented the surface from becoming muddy. Wood shavings absorbed moisture, but needed nitrogen-rich material around them. Vegetable scraps drew the hens' attention, though too many at once created wet pockets. Manure supplied nitrogen, but large clumps had to be broken before entering the bay. Charlotte stopped seeing waste as a single category. Every material had a function. The dry ingredients held air and absorbed moisture. The wet ingredients fed decomposition. The hens connected them. She wrote the pattern in her notebook: dry material for structure, wet material for life, air for the process, hens for movement, time for completion. Once the worked bedding became darker and more evenly mixed, Charlotte removed it from the second bay. At first, she tried using a pitchfork while the hens were still inside. The birds crowded around her boots, hunting for insects in every lifted forkful. She quickly learned to move them into the yard before transferring material. She placed the partly decomposed bedding into the third bay and shaped it into a low mound. Then she left it alone. No grain, no chickens, no fresh scraps. This was the resting stage. The hens had started the mixing process, but the material still needed time to stabilize. Fresh manure and partially decomposed waste were not ready to go directly into the garden. Charlotte covered the mound loosely with old burlap to keep it from drying too quickly. Every few days, she checked the moisture and turned only the most compacted sections. The center continued to warm. The smell changed from sharp manure to something closer to damp forest soil. That change gave Charlotte confidence. but she refused to call the system finished. One successful batch did not prove that 100 hens could work safely in the same space. So she expanded in stages. She added 8 more birds to the working bay. Then 10. Each time, she watched the surface. Too few hens left the material untouched. Too many stripped the bay quickly, crowded the corners, and created more manure than the dry bedding could absorb. The right number depended on the space, the amount of incoming material, and how often Charlotte moved the bedding. There was no magical flock size. There was only balance. Everett visited again near the end of the second week. The 3 bays stood behind Charlotte like a rough wooden machine. Fresh leaves and straw filled the first. 20 hens scratched steadily through the second. A dark mound rested in the third. Everett leaned on the gate. "You built all this for birds the county threw away." Charlotte shook her head. "I built it for everything the farm was throwing away." She pointed to the first bay. "That used to sit in piles." Then to the second. "That used to require work I couldn't keep up with." Finally, to the third. "And that may become something the soil can use?" Everett watched a hen drag a piece of straw backward, exposing damp material beneath it. "You still have to move it." "Yes." "You still have to manage it." "Yes." "So the hens don't do everything." Charlotte smiled. "They do the part they were already built to do." That evening, as the flock settled, Charlotte stood between the 3 bays and listened to the fading sound of scratching. The system was simple, but it was no longer accidental. Waste entered one side. The hens mixed it. Time finished it. For the first time since arriving at the farm, Charlotte was not looking at a collection of separate problems. She was looking at a process. And every morning, it began moving again on 100 small feet. The system failed on a Thursday afternoon. Charlotte had been too pleased with the progress of the first batches. The hens were mixing faster than she expected. The resting pile was warming evenly, and the sour odor that once hung behind the barn had nearly disappeared. Then the market in town called. A refrigerator had failed overnight, leaving the produce manager with crates of wilted lettuce, bruised tomatoes, split melon, and soft squash he could no longer sell. He remembered Charlotte's offer to collect clean vegetable waste and asked whether she wanted all of it. Charlotte looked at the 3 compost bays and saw free fertility. She did not ask how much all of it meant. By noon, 2 pickup loads were sitting beside the barn. The waste was heavier than it looked. Tomatoes had burst inside their crates, filling the bottoms with pink liquid. Melons had split open. Lettuce had collapsed into wet mats. Some of the squash had already begun to soften beneath the summer heat. Charlotte knew she should divide the load over several days. Instead, she wanted the pile cleared before rain arrived. She spread the waste across the working bay, covered it with a thin layer of straw, and let the hens in. At first, everything looked successful. The flock rushed forward, pecking at seeds, tearing into melon flesh, and chasing insects that had gathered beneath the crates. The surface moved with wings, feet, and flying straw. Charlotte smiled as she watched. By evening, the birds had eaten much of what interested them. What remained had been trampled into a thick, wet layer. She added wood shavings, but not enough. The next morning, the smell reached the kitchen. It was not the mild scent of manure or damp bedding. It was sharp, sweet, and rotten at the same time. Beneath it ran the unmistakable sting of ammonia. Charlotte crossed the yard quickly. The surface of the bay looked dark and greasy. The wet produce had collapsed, sealing the spaces between the straw. Each step pressed liquid upward around her boots. The hens crowded near the gate instead of scratching. A few stood on the wooden border to keep their feet out of the bedding. Others remained beneath the shed roof, unwilling to enter the central area. Charlotte knew immediately that she had made a serious mistake. She had mistaken volume for opportunity. The pile contained plenty of nitrogen-rich material and moisture, but too little carbon and too little structure. The weight of the produce had compressed the bedding, pushing out the air. Instead of decomposing evenly, the lower layer had begun breaking down without enough oxygen. The hens could scratch through loose material. They could not rescue a sealed, waterlogged mass. Charlotte opened the side gate and moved the flock into the yard. Some birds hurried out. Others had to be guided gently around the worst section. She checked their feet one by one. Several were caked with wet bedding. One hen had a red patch between her toes where the skin had remained damp too long. Charlotte carried those birds to the recovery pen, washed their feet, and replaced the bedding with clean, dry stuff. Only after the hens were safe did she return to the compost bay. She drove the pitchfork into the center. The material came up in heavy slabs. Steam rose from some sections. But the heat was uneven. The smell beneath the surface was worse than the air above it. Charlotte spread the mass across the empty ground beside the bays. Breaking it into thinner layers, she opened the remaining spoiled hay bales, pulled away the dry upper sections, and mixed them into the wet waste. Then she added leaves, wood shavings, and chopped corn stalks. The work took hours. Every forkful reminded her of the machine she had hoped not to become. By late afternoon, sweat had soaked through her shirt. Her shoulders burned, and the smell clung to her skin. That was when the county truck arrived. The inspector stepped out, wearing clean boots and carrying a clipboard. Everett followed in his own pickup a few minutes later. A neighbor had complained about the odor. The inspector walked toward the spread material, stopped several feet away, and frowned. "You're receiving commercial waste now? Vegetable waste?" Charlotte said, "No meat. No chemicals. That isn't the issue." He pointed toward the hens in the yard. "You were warned those birds had no productive value. Now you've built a waste problem around them." Charlotte looked at the dark bedding spread across the ground. At that moment, the accusation felt difficult to argue with. The inspector continued writing. "This is exactly why experimental systems fail. People assume animals will manage what should be handled with equipment." Charlotte's face tightened. "I assumed they could work through more material than they could." "So you agree?" "I agree that I overloaded the system." Everett stood near the gate. "Sila." The inspector looked at the wet pile again. "Those hens are not compost machines." "No," Charlotte said. "They're not." The answer seemed to surprise him. Charlotte set the pitchfork upright. "They can scratch. They can mix loose bedding. They can add manure and expose material to air. But they cannot fix a pile I built badly." The inspector closed his clipboard. "You have 48 hours to control the odor." After the truck left, Everett walked toward the spread bedding. "You knew this could happen?" "I knew too much wet material was a problem." "But you added it anyway." Charlotte nodded. "I wanted the free material more than I respected the limit." Everett lifted a handful of the mixture and let it fall. "What now?" "We dry it. Open it. Rebuild it in smaller batches." "And the chickens?" "They stay out until the bay is safe." For the next 2 days, Charlotte worked methodically. She mixed dry carbon into every wet section. She rebuilt the pile loosely, leaving coarse stalks inside to create air spaces. She covered it before the rain, but left the sides open. She moved only a small amount back into the working bay. Before returning the hens, she knelt beside the bedding and smelled it. The sour sweetness had faded. The ammonia sting was gone. The material was damp, but no longer greasy. When she squeezed a handful, it held its shape briefly, then fell apart. She released 6 hens into the bay. They stepped forward cautiously. One scratched, then another. Within minutes, the familiar rustling returned. Charlotte did not feel victorious. She felt corrected. The failure had taught her the most important truth in the system. Natural behavior was powerful, but it was not magic. The hens could multiply good management. They could also reveal bad management faster than any report. When they refused to enter the pile, Charlotte should have listened before the smell reached the road. That evening, she added a new line to her notebook. "Do not ask the animals to repair a mistake made by the farmer." Then she underlined it twice. After the failure, Charlotte stopped trusting the calendar. Before, she had assumed that a pile needed a certain number of days before it could be moved, turned, or rested. Now she understood that time alone meant very little. A pile could sit for weeks and remain cold, dry, and unchanged. Another could overheat in 2 days. The material had to be read. Every morning, Charlotte began with the same inspection. She looked first. Was the surface loose or flattened? Had the hens scratched evenly? Or had they crowded along the edges? Were there dark, wet patches beneath the waterer? Had any layer formed a hard crust? Then she smelled. A healthy working bay carried the scent of straw, damp leaves, and manure softened by earthiness. A sharp ammonia smell meant something was out of balance. A sour smell suggested wet material had become compressed and starved of air. Finally, she touched. She pushed her hand beneath the top layer and squeezed a handful. If water ran between her fingers, the pile was too wet. If the material would not hold together at all, it was too dry. What she wanted was a texture that formed briefly under pressure, then crumbled when released. The pile did not need to be perfect. It needed to remain workable. Charlotte made a wooden probe from an old broom handle. She pushed it deep into the bedding, left it there for several minutes, then pulled it out and pressed the wood against the inside of her wrist. Cold wood meant little activity. Warm wood meant decomposition was building. Wood too hot to hold comfortably meant the pile needed attention before the hens returned. She did not have expensive instruments. She had observation. And she had the birds. The hens began teaching her more than the pile itself. When conditions were right, they entered quickly. They scratched with both feet, paused to peck, then moved forward again. Their movements spread across the entire bay. When the surface became too dry, they worked only where food was visible. Dust rose around their bodies, and the lighter shavings drifted against the fence. When the bedding became too wet, they avoided the center. They remained on the edges or climbed onto boards and roots where their feet stayed dry. When a hidden pocket began heating too strongly, the birds crossed it without stopping. Charlotte learned to watch hesitation. One morning, she opened the gate, and 20 hens entered the bay. Most went directly toward the grain she had buried beneath a fresh layer of straw. But 3 stopped. They stretched their necks forward, stepped once into the center, then backed away. Charlotte followed them. The surface looked normal. When she pushed the wooden probe into the bedding, however, the lower material felt unusually hot. Beneath a layer of dry straw was a dense pocket of grass clippings she had added the day before. The clippings had matted together and begun heating rapidly. Without the bird's reaction, she might not have noticed until the entire section developed an odor. She removed the hens, opened the pocket with a fork, and mixed in coarse leaves and chopped stalks. The heat fell by afternoon. Charlotte wrote another note. The hens do not explain the problem. They point toward it. That distinction became central to the way she managed the system. A bird standing at the edge did not automatically mean the pile was too hot. It could mean there was no food there. It could mean another hen had driven it away. It could mean the bedding felt unstable. Behavior was a clue, not a conclusion. Charlotte compared what the birds did with what she could smell, touch, and see. Each sign became stronger when another sign supported it. If the hens avoided the center and the bedding smelled sour, she opened the pile. If the hens scratched eagerly but the material remained dry and pale, she added moisture. If ammonia rose from the surface and the hens stayed outside, she added carbon and reduced fresh manure. The system became less mysterious. It was not a recipe with fixed amounts. It was a conversation between materials, weather, animals, and management. Rain changed everything. After several wet days, even covered bedding absorbed moisture from the air. Charlotte used more straw and fewer vegetable scraps. During dry weather, the outer layer lost moisture quickly. She sprinkled water across the bay in the evening, giving it time to soak in before the hens returned the next morning. Cold weather slowed the process. Warm weather made mistakes develop faster. Charlotte adjusted in smaller steps. That was another lesson from the failure. Large corrections could create new problems. If a pile was too wet, she did not bury it under a mountain of wood shavings. She added a thin layer, let the hens work it in, and checked again. If it was too dry, she did not pour buckets of water into one spot. She misted the surface, mixed it, and waited. Management became less about forcing the pile and more about keeping it within a useful range. The hens improved as well. Their feathers began returning. Their combs became redder. The stronger birds moved with more energy, while the weaker ones spent less time sitting near the walls. Charlotte kept clean feed available. The compost bay was not their only food source, and she never treated waste as a replacement for proper nutrition. The birds worked because scratching was natural. They did not work because they were hungry enough to accept anything. That difference mattered to her. Everett noticed it during one of his visits. He watched Charlotte stop before opening the gate. "What are you waiting for?" he asked. "The hens. They're behind you." "I know." Charlotte opened the door. The flock entered, but several birds turned left instead of moving toward the center. Charlotte followed them, knelt, and uncovered a dark patch beneath the straw. The bedding near the water line had become wet. She carried in a basket of dry leaves and spread them thinly over the area. Everett shook his head. "You make it look like they're giving instructions." "They are. They can't talk. They don't need to." Charlotte pointed toward the flock. "The pile tells me what is happening. The hens tell me where to look." Everett watched as the birds returned to the corrected area and began scratching. For the first time, he did not laugh. By the end of the month, Charlotte no longer saw the hens simply as workers. Workers followed orders. The flock did something more valuable. They responded honestly to the conditions she created. They could not be convinced by a notebook or fooled by an optimistic plan. If the bedding was wrong, their feet revealed it. If the pile was safe, loose, and full of life, they entered eagerly. Charlotte had once believed she was teaching the hens to work compost. Now she understood that they were teaching her how to read it. The farm had not become automatic. It had become observable. And once Charlotte could see the system clearly, she could begin to improve it before failure announced itself through smell. Charlotte chose the narrowest garden bed for the test. It ran along the south side of the barn, where the soil had always been difficult. In spring, water collected on the surface and formed a gray crust. By early summer, the same bed hardened so badly that Charlotte had to strike it with the edge of a shovel before she could plant. She divided the bed into 2 equal sections. On the first half, she spread a layer of finished compost from the resting bay. The material was dark, loose, and no longer carried the sharp smell of manure. Pieces of straw were still visible, but they broke easily between her fingers. On the second half, she added nothing. She planted the same variety of beans in both sections. At the same depth and on the same morning, Charlotte knew the comparison would not be perfect. Soil varied even across a few feet. Shade from the barn reached one side slightly earlier in the afternoon. The test was not a scientific trial, but it was better than relying on hope. She marked the center with a wooden stake and wrote in her notebook, "Left side, compost. Right side, untreated." Then she waited. For the first week, there was little difference. A few seedlings appeared on both sides. The composted section looked slightly darker after watering, but Charlotte could not tell whether that mattered. Everett came by and leaned over the fence. "Looks like beans," he said. "That is the idea. Which side is supposed to be the miracle?" "Neither." He smiled. "At least you're learning." Charlotte ignored him, but she understood his point. She had spent months believing the hens could become part of a larger system. Now she needed evidence that the system actually improved the farm. Warm compost and reduced waste were useful, but the soil was the final test. If the finished material did not help the land hold water, support roots, or become easier to work, Then the entire project would remain an interesting way to manage bedding. Charlotte wanted more than that. She wanted fertility she did not have to buy. The first clear difference appeared after a hard rain. The storm arrived just before midnight and continued for nearly 3 hours. Water ran from the barn roof in heavy sheets. By morning, the yard was covered in shallow puddles. Charlotte pulled on her boots and walked directly to the test bed. The untreated half had formed a smooth surface. Water sat in small depressions, and the top layer had begun sealing into a pale crust. The composted half looked different. There were no deep puddles. The surface remained uneven and crumbly. Water had entered the soil, instead of remaining entirely above it. Charlotte knelt and pressed her fingers into both sections. On the untreated side, the surface was slick, but the soil beneath it remained dense. Her fingers stopped after less than an inch. On the composted side, the soil felt softer. It held moisture without turning into paste. She could push deeper before meeting resistance. The difference was small, but it was real. She drew a line beneath the note in her book. After rain, a mended section absorbed water faster. The beans began showing the same pattern. Plants grew on both sides, but those in the composted soil emerged more evenly. Their leaves opened wider, and the stems remained upright during a dry stretch later that week. Charlotte did not claim the compost was responsible for every difference. Some seeds might have been stronger than others. A buried stone could have blocked one root and not another. Still, the pattern continued. When she watered, the untreated section dried quickly at the surface and then hardened. The composted soil stayed darker longer and did not seal as badly. Charlotte began digging small inspection holes beside the plants. On the untreated side, roots remained close to the surface. They spread sideways along the easiest path. On the amended side, several roots had moved deeper. One morning, she found an earthworm near the edge of the composted bed. There was nothing extraordinary about a single worm, but Charlotte had rarely seen them in that part of the garden. She lifted it gently and covered it again. Then she sat back on her heels. The hens had not touched this soil. They had never scratched in the garden bed or walked between the bean rows. Yet their work had arrived here. Their manure had mixed with leaves, stuff, and vegetable waste. Their feet had opened the material to air. Their searching had broken soft scraps into smaller pieces. Time had completed what the birds began. Now that process was changing how the soil behaved. Charlotte returned to the compost bays and looked at the flock with a different kind of respect. The hens had always produced something visible: eggs, feathers, manure. But the value she was measuring now was indirect. They had helped transform waste into a material that changed water movement, soil structure, and root growth. That was harder to count than eggs. It was also harder to dismiss. 2 weeks later, Everett returned during the hottest part of the afternoon. Charlotte led him to the bean bed without explanation. He looked at the plants, then at the stake dividing the two sections. The difference was now obvious. The beans on the composted side were fuller and more evenly spaced. On the untreated side, several plants had yellowed, and bare patches remained where seedlings had failed. Everett crouched and pressed his thumb into the ground. He tested one side, then the other. "This one is softer," he said. "Yes." "You water them the same?" "Yes." "Same seed?" "Same packet." He rubbed the darker soil between his fingers. "What did you add?" "The batch from the resting bay." Everett looked toward the chicken enclosure. "So the birds made this?" Charlotte shook her head. "The whole system made it." She pointed toward the barn. The leaves gave carbon. The manure and scraps added nitrogen. The hens mixed it. Microbes broke it down. Time finished it. Everett stood slowly. "That is a longer answer than yes. It is also the honest one." Charlotte did not want the hens turned into a rural miracle. They had not repaired the garden by themselves. They had supported one stage of a managed biological process, but without them, Charlotte would have struggled to mix the volume of material regularly enough to keep the system moving. That practical difference mattered more than a miracle. At the end of the month, Charlotte harvested the first beans. The composted side produced more, though not dramatically more. The pods were not twice as large. The plants did not become giants. The success was quieter. More seeds had survived. The soil remained easier to work. Water entered instead of pooling. Roots reached deeper. Charlotte placed the harvest from each side into separate baskets and set them on the porch. One basket was heavier. Not enough to change her finances. Not enough to silence the county. But enough to prove that the process had crossed a boundary. The hens were no longer simply reducing waste behind the barn. They were helping manufacture something the farm could use. Charlotte opened her notebook and wrote, "First proof. The soil changed before the numbers did." Then she walked back to the compost bays, where 100 old hens were scratching through a new layer of leaves. For the county, they still produced too few eggs. For Charlotte, they had just produced their first visible piece of land. The county inspector returned in early autumn. This time, there was no complaint about odor. Charlotte's compost bays were clean, the hens were healthier, and the garden showed clear improvement. Still, the inspector carried the same clipboard. He counted the hens, checked the feed records, and asked how many eggs the flock produced each week. Charlotte answered honestly. The number was low. Some hens laid occasionally. Many did not lay at all. The inspector wrote something down. "Then the flock is still operating at a loss," he said. Charlotte looked toward the compost bays. "That depends on what you count." He turned to her. "Feed goes in. Eggs come out. That is the basic calculation." Charlotte led him behind the barn. She showed him the piles that had once covered the ground. Spoiled hay, leaves, manure, vegetable scraps, and used bedding. Most of them were gone. In their place were 3 organized bays and a dark mound of finished compost. "I used to pay to remove some of this," Charlotte said. "I also paid for fertilizer." The inspector looked at the compost but did not respond. Charlotte continued, "The hens eat insects and usable scraps. They break apart bedding. They mix wet material with dry material. The finished compost goes into the garden. That does not make them productive layers." "I never said it did." She took him to the 2 bean beds. The untreated section had pale, hard soil. The amended section was darker and easier to dig. Charlotte pushed a shovel into both. The blade entered the composted soil with far less resistance. The inspector watched, but his expression remained unchanged. His report had spaces for egg production, feed cost, bird age, and resale value. There was no space for reduced waste. No line for compost. No box for improved water absorption. No column for fertilizer. Charlotte no longer needed to buy. The report was not false. It was simply incomplete. The county measured the job these hens stopped doing. Charlotte said, "It never measured the work they started doing here." The inspector closed his folder. "That kind of value is difficult to verify." Charlotte nodded. "It is also difficult to see from a desk." He left without changing the flock's official classification. The report arrived a week later. The hens were still described as low-value livestock, with poor economic performance. Charlotte pinned the page above the compost bays. Across the top, she wrote one sentence in black ink. "They counted the eggs. They missed the soil." The report did not discourage her. It clarified the conflict. The county judged each part separately. The hens were supposed to produce eggs. The garden was supposed to produce vegetables. The waste was supposed to be removed. Charlotte's farm worked differently. The hens helped process the waste. The waste became compost. The compost improved the soil. The soil supported the garden. The garden produced food and scraps that returned to the hens. No single part looked impressive alone. The value appeared only when the parts were connected. Charlotte no longer needed the county to agree. The beans had already answered for her. The softer soil had answered. The shrinking waste piles had answered. The report remained above the bays. gathering dust while the hens scratched beneath it. The county had numbers. Charlotte had a working cycle. By late autumn, Charlotte's farm began producing less waste, not because less material entered the property, but because fewer things stopped at the end of a pile. Damaged vegetables from the garden went to the hens. Leaves and straw became bedding. Used bedding moved into the compost bays. Finished compost returned to the soil. The garden then produced more vegetables, more roots, and more plant material for the next cycle. Charlotte had not eliminated outside costs, but she had reduced how often the farm needed to buy a solution. That mattered. She still purchased proper feed for the hens. Scraps from the garden were useful, but they were not a complete diet. She still removed unsafe material, spoiled food, and anything that did not belong in the system. The goal was not to make the farm completely self-sufficient. The goal was to stop wasting what it already had. As the soil improved, Charlotte expanded the composted area beyond the original bean bed. She worked finished material into a row of cabbage, then into the orchard around several weak apple trees. The changes remained gradual. The soil did not become rich overnight, but it held moisture longer. It broke apart more easily. Plants established themselves more evenly. The hens changed too. Some regained feathers. Some began laying occasionally. Others never returned to regular egg production. Charlotte accepted that. Eggs were now one benefit among many. A local grocery store began saving clean vegetable trimmings for her twice a week. Charlotte accepted only what she could process safely. She had learned that free material became expensive when it exceeded the system's capacity. She also began collecting bags of dry leaves from nearby homes. In exchange, she offered small amounts of finished compost. The arrangement was simple. People brought her materials they considered waste. Charlotte returned something useful. Everett watched the system expand through the season. One afternoon, he found Charlotte spreading compost beneath the apple trees. "You're running out of waste piles," he said. "That was the idea. And the hens are still not laying much." Charlotte looked toward the enclosure. "No. So what do you call them now?" She rested the shovel against the tree. "A work crew." Everett smiled. The phrase spread. Soon, visitors who came for eggs asked to see the compost hens. Charlotte showed them the 3 bays and explained the process without exaggeration. The birds mixed loose bedding. They helped expose material to air. Their manure added nitrogen, but they did not replace proper management, safe feeding, rest time, or finished composting. The system worked because each part had a clear role. Charlotte had once seen the farm as a collection of shortages. Not enough money, not enough machinery, not enough fertility. Now she saw movement. Leaves became bedding. Bedding became compost. Compost became soil. Soil became food. Food scraps returned to the flock. The county's report had judged the hens as an isolated expense. Charlotte's farm no longer operated in isolated parts. Its value existed in the connections. By winter, the 3 compost bays were no longer an experiment behind the barn. They had become the center of the farm, and every morning, the cycle began again with the sound of old hens scratching beneath fresh straw. The county invited Charlotte to speak at a small agricultural field day the following spring. The event focused on reducing organic waste across farms, schools, and community gardens. Charlotte almost declined. She had no polished equipment, no research team, and no desire to pretend her system was perfect. But she remembered the report above the compost bays, so she agreed. On the morning of the demonstration, county officials, local farmers, and several curious neighbors gathered behind her barn. Charlotte had prepared 3 wheelbarrows. The first held fresh leaves, stuff, vegetable scraps, and manure. The second held material recently worked by the hens. It was darker, broken into smaller pieces, and evenly mixed. The third contained finished compost from the resting bay. She began without a speech. She simply let the hens into the working enclosure. The flock spread across the fresh bedding at once. Their feet pulled dry material backward while their beaks searched beneath the surface. Within minutes, the neat layers began disappearing into one another. These birds do not create finished compost by themselves, Charlotte explained. They mix loose materials, add manure, expose buried sections to air, and break soft waste into smaller pieces. She pointed to the resting bay. After that, the material still needs time. The county inspector stood near the front of the group. He watched without taking notes. Charlotte then led everyone to the garden. The two original test beds were still visible. One had received compost. The other had not. She pushed a shovel into the untreated soil. The blade stopped against the hard ground. Then she pushed it into the amended section. The shovel entered easily. Charlotte lifted a clump of dark, crumbly soil and held it out. "This is not proof that chickens can fix every soil problem," she said. "It is proof that waste can become useful when each part of the system has a job." She showed them her records. The amount of material collected, the feed she still purchased, the batches that failed, the fertilizer costs she had reduced. The compost returned to the garden. She did not hide the ammonia problem or the overloaded pile. In fact, she spent more time explaining the failure than the success. That honesty changed the mood. The system was no longer a charming story about rescued birds. It was a practical method with limits, risks, and measurable benefits. At the end of the demonstration, Charlotte removed the old county report from the barn wall. The word "worthless" was still printed near the top. She laid the page across an empty crate and placed a handful of finished compost over it. "These hens did not become young again," she said. "Most of them never returned to regular egg production." The group became quiet, but the county measured only what they had stopped producing. It never measured what they could still help create. The inspector looked from the report to the compost, then toward the hens, still scratching through the bedding. No one laughed. For the first time, the flock was not being judged by the number of eggs in a basket. People were looking at the waste that had disappeared, the soil that had changed, and the system working in front of them. Charlotte had not turned worthless hens into a miracle. She had turned overlooked behavior into useful work, and now the county could finally see it. The call came 3 weeks after the field day. Charlotte was repairing a gate when the county extension office asked whether she would demonstrate the compost system at 2 community gardens and a small school farm. The request surprised her less than the language they used. They no longer called the hens low-value livestock. They called them part of a low-cost organic waste system. Charlotte agreed, but only on one condition. She would not present the method as a miracle. At the first demonstration, she showed the same 3-stage process: fresh material, the working bay, and the resting pile. She explained that the hens could mix loose bedding, break apart soft scraps, add manure, and expose buried material to air. Then she explained what they could not do. They could not safely process unlimited waste. They could not replace proper feed. They could not correct a pile that was too wet, too dense, or badly managed. Most importantly, the material still needed time to finish decomposing before it returned to the soil. The county inspector attended the second demonstration. This time, he stood beside Charlotte instead of across from her. When someone asked why the county had sold the hens in the first place, he answered carefully. They were evaluated as laying birds. He said, that evaluation did not consider this use. Charlotte appreciated the honesty. The county had not been completely wrong. The hens were poor commercial layers. Their mistake had been assuming that one failed purpose meant no purpose remained. Requests continued through the spring. A community garden wanted help managing leaves and plant waste. A small orchard asked whether hens could work through old bedding between seasons. A school invited Charlotte to explain how nutrients moved through a farm. She gave the same warning every time: start smaller than you think you need to. That lesson had cost her 2 days of exhausting work and nearly harmed the flock. She wanted others to learn it, without repeating her failure. Back at the farm, the old hens continued their routine. They scratched through straw, leaves, and carefully measured scraps. The finished compost moved into the garden and beneath the fruit trees. The system remained modest. Charlotte did not become wealthy. She did not build an industrial operation. What changed was the farm's dependence on outside inputs and the way people viewed the flock. Visitors no longer asked how many eggs the hens produced. They asked how much bedding they could mix. They asked how Charlotte controlled moisture. They asked how long the resting stage lasted. The questions had changed because the definition of value had changed. One afternoon, the inspector returned with a new county information sheet. It described poultry-assisted composting for small farms and community gardens. Near the bottom, a paragraph warned that birds should be properly fed, protected from unsafe material, and removed when conditions became too wet or hot. Charlotte read the page twice. There was no mention of worthless hens. She pinned it beside the original report. The 2 pages told the entire story. The first measured what the flock had stopped doing. The second described what Charlotte had learned they could still do. Outside, the hens scratched beneath a fresh layer of leaves. The sound was ordinary now. That was what made it important. What had once looked like a desperate experiment had become a repeatable process. The county had sold Charlotte 100 liabilities. She had returned with a working system. By the second winter, the farm no longer looked abandoned. The garden beds rested beneath dark compost. The orchard floor held a layer of leaves and straw. Behind the barn, the 3 compost bays continued their quiet cycle. The hens were older now. Some still laid an occasional egg. Many did not. A few moved slowly and spent more time in the sun than in the working bay. Charlotte never forced them to scratch. The flock worked only when the birds were healthy enough and the material was safe. One cold evening, Charlotte stood beside the enclosure while the hens searched through a fresh layer of leaves. Their movements were small. A backward step, a quick peck, a dry leaf turning over. Nothing about it looked impressive. Yet those same motions had changed the farm. The hens had helped mix waste that once accumulated behind the barn. The compost had improved the garden soil. The garden had produced more food and more usable scraps. The farm now depended less on purchased fertilizer and outside disposal. The system had not made Charlotte rich. It had made the farm more resilient. She looked at the original county report, still pinned beside the newer information sheet. Both documents described the same flock. One called the hens worthless because they no longer performed well as commercial layers. The other described them as part of a composting system. The birds had not changed as much as the way people measured them. Charlotte understood that this was the deeper lesson. A hen could lay eggs, but it could also scratch soil, uncover insects, break apart bedding, add manure, and help move nutrients through a farm. Land could grow crops, but it could also hold water, support microorganisms, receive waste, and rebuild slowly over time. Even failure could have more than one purpose. The spoiled pile had embarrassed Charlotte and nearly ended the experiment. It had also taught her the limits that made the final system safer. The county had judged the hens by one declining function. Charlotte had judged them by their place inside a larger cycle. That difference had changed everything. She opened the gate and carried in a basket of dry leaves. The hens gathered around her boots. Charlotte spread the leaves across the bedding, then scattered a small amount of grain beneath them. The flock began scratching. The sound moved through the enclosure like light rain. There was no audience now. No inspector. No neighbor waiting to laugh. Only an old flock, doing ordinary work inside a system built to notice it. Charlotte watched until the last daylight disappeared behind the orchard. The county had called the hens worthless because they had stopped doing one job. Charlotte saved them because she could see the dozen jobs no one had bothered to count.